Well, hello and welcome to this week's episode that I'm so excited about. As you know, I'm going through questions and problems that you guys are sending in to me. And someone wrote in about vulnerability and that she's hearing all of this about the power of vulnerability, but she feels bad. She feels like she shares too much too soon when she meets someone. And so she doesn't understand what all the talk is about vulnerability. So I want to be specific and talk about what I call voluntary vulnerability. So, vulnerability itself is basically being willing to share yourself even though you know you're not perfect, right? Being willing to be seen as you are. That's what being vulnerable is. Being vulnerable is. It isn't just sharing yourself, right? Because look at Instagram and all these other things. People share themselves all the time in a very curated way. That's not what we're talking about. So in this episode today, I'm going to be giving you some 6 ideas of how you can develop and nurture voluntary vulnerability in your life and in your relationships. So let's talk a little bit about why this is hard to do. Why is vulnerability itself? It can be difficult to do. Part of it is many of you have written in, you're perfectionists, so you suffer from this perfectionism where everything has to look a certain way or be a certain way. What happens when you feel that way is that nothing is good enough. So revealing your humanness is that much harder when you suffer from perfectionism. And you know who you are. Don't worry, we'll be talking about this as well. That's one of the questions that came in. I'll be handling that in the next few weeks. But understand that being vulnerable does require a certain amount of strength, right? To be willing to share the truth about who we are with people. But the difference between voluntary vulnerability and vulnerability is that with voluntary vulnerability, you are making a conscious, mindful choice to be vulnerable. So let's talk about how do you set yourself up to curate to decide when you will allow yourself to be vulnerable with people and basically in what circumstances. So first, let's talk about some dysfunction. For those of you who write in and say you share too much too soon, this is an indication of having disordered boundaries. I found that with so many women who've been in my courses, they'll say, well, I'm dating now, but I mean, how long do I wait until I tell them all the things that I've been through and everything that I've experienced? And I'm like, maybe never, right? That if there's a sense that you have to confess, that's not vulnerability, that's having bad boundaries. If you want to share something in time, that's a different story. But if you meet someone and you drink too much tequila and you spill your whole entire guts about your whole life, how do you feel the next day? It's called a vulnerability hangover, where you're like, oh my God, why did I do that? But some people don't have to be drunk to do that. Some people don't know the difference between vulnerability and mindful or voluntary vulnerability. So let's talk a little bit more about that. Why don't we want to just spill our guts? Because why do we want a perfect stranger to have access to our most tender heart? We don't. Trust is not something that is just given or a given. Emotional trust is something that is earned over time when someone continues to show up and tell us and show us with their actions that they are trustworthy. So again, I want you to imagine this like your VIP section, right, of your life. People don't just get to be in there, right? You need to decide that they belong in there and that you want them to be in there. That is a different story than people just showing up. Same thing with vulnerability. You don't owe anyone anything. And I'm not saying being super secretive, because that's another form of disordered boundaries. If you never share yourself at all, if you're isolated, if everyone else talks but you never share. And that also, both of those things are blocks to intimacy. Too much, sharing too soon, is a block to intimacy because it's overwhelming to other people most of the time. And then you feel regret and you feel judged and all of those things that happen. And never sharing. You know these people. I know them. They are like expert interviewers. They're your friends who are like, no, wait, tell me about this. So what happened with your niece? And what happened with your cousin? And, oh, how's your husband? And what's happened with your husband's knee? And they remember everything about you, but you don't know squat about them. And trust me, even if they're being loving, that's by design, in that they don't want to be vulnerable at all. And that is a very imbalanced relationship. I had a relationship like that years ago. It was the wife of one of my husband's friends. And I felt every time I was with her, it was like the Inquisition, where she was asking me about this. Oh, is your cousin still having that weight problem? Oh, is your sister's divorce still terrible? Like, first of all, it would be painful things she's bringing back up. I'm like, wow, thanks. But it's almost like, as women, or at least in my experience, if someone asks a question, it took me to grow and learn and strengthen my own internal boundaries and my interactional boundaries to be able to make a choice in the moment of like, maybe I didn't feel like talking about that. Maybe I don't want to tell you that. And so people asking intrusive information, and sometimes we're just spontaneously sharing, right? It doesn't even have to be. But there are a lot of times when someone is straight up asking a question, and it took until I was in my early 30s maybe, until I really got like, oh, hey, just because you ask doesn't mean I have to tell you anything. You can ask, and I can say, I actually don't really want to talk about that. That can be. Or, I don't want to get into that right now. There's all other creative ways that you can also answer if someone is asking intrusive questions, but that is actually for another video. But talking about verbal self-defense, which is something that Kasia Urbaniak basically created, at least that's where I learned it from, where if someone asks you an intrusive question, I'll just tell you the one thing and then we'll move on. How did something like bad, like, so how did your mother die, let's say? And you just flip it back on the asker and say, why would you ask me that? Or, why would you want to know that? And this is a way of flipping it back and putting the attention back on them, not on you answering the question, on why would they ask you that? Because of their morbid curiosity? Hi, that's gross. Please don't, right? So anyway, back to voluntary vulnerability. Let's talk about the 6 steps that you can take to be voluntarily vulnerable when you want to be. But we really do want it to be a choice. As I said before, the first step is you must be discerning, right? You open up your most tender heart to the people in your life who you have built mutual trust with. So you have evidence that they are trustworthy, right? This is what being discerning is, right? Don't share with people who you know will belittle you, who will judge you, right? Or who will, if they're unempathic listeners, they're like, yeah, well, if you would listen to me 3 weeks ago, like that's not who you need to share something with if you're feeling very tender. So number 1 is be discerning. Number 2 is to not manipulate and not allow yourself to be manipulated, right? When you do open up to someone, make sure that you're not sharing, right, to seek attention or to create that instant intimacy. It's almost like you might have a shocking story of what happened in your childhood. And if you just like dump it on someone you barely know, that is a way of grabbing their attention, but it's manipulative because they're not the person that you should be sharing that with, right? It's not actually appropriate. If they claim and also if somebody claims that you are their best friend, let's say, but you don't feel that way about them, you have to stick to the way you feel. Someone else's reality is not your reality. And they may be seeking some instant intimacy, but that really isn't the way intimacy works. It's the same way that trust works. It must be built over time if it's going to have a solid foundation. So let's talk about the difference between authenticity, this is the third thing, and vulnerability. So being real is not the same as spilling your guts too early. And I think a lot of times these two things get conflated. Is that the word I want? I think it is. Where you think one is the other. So you can be true to yourself and be authentic and not be oversharing. So oversharing isn't you know, some people will say, well, listen, I just tell the truth. I let it all hang out. You can always come to me and expect that I'm going to be honest with you. Nah, sharing too much too soon actually isn't the same as being authentic and honest. It's simply sharing too much too soon. So be really clear about what that is. All right. What is the key component to vulnerability, to healthy vulnerability, to voluntary vulnerability? Boundaries, right? So that is number 4. This is the understanding of appropriate levels of sharing. So, and it can be physical boundaries as well. So to create voluntary vulnerability, if you're dating someone and you've been on one date and they text you, hit you up at midnight and say, hey, I'm near your apartment, what's up? You draw the boundary. If you want real vulnerability and you're not ready to have sex with them, then you don't let them come to your apartment. You say, oh, yeah, it's kind of late. Good luck getting home, So boundaries in all ways. And that doesn't mean build walls. It means take your time. It means observe the way people behave. If you're dating someone and from the beginning of you dating them, they say one thing and do another, they're not trustworthy. It doesn't make them evil. It just means they're not trustworthy. So you've got to be mindful. Why would you want to make yourself vulnerable to someone who doesn't keep their word? Because it's not a safe thing to do. I can tell you that right now. And people are always showing us who they are with their behavior. It's just a matter of, do we listen? Do we follow through with our gut instinct when we go, well, that was kind of offensive. I can't believe he was by my apartment. What do you expect? I was going to have him come up and just have sex with him? Like, wow. Instead of that, we make excuses. And so the boundaries are so important because you have to be honest with yourself about where boundaries have to be put in place. All right, move on. Number 5. So self-love actually fuels healthy and voluntary vulnerability. So let me say a teeny bit more about that. How you treat yourself has everything to do with how other people treat you. When you really focus on treating yourself with kindness and with compassion, taking good care of yourself, it will be natural for you to be voluntarily vulnerable instead of indiscriminately vulnerable, let's say. So I want you to really think about that, right? When you accept and love all of you, you don't worry so much if someone else is not going to. And this is a really important piece of voluntary vulnerability because it all comes from your ability to draw boundaries, strengthens as your self-esteem, your relationship with yourself gets better, as your self-care gets better. So always boundaries. Ain't that the truth? All right, last one is voluntary vulnerability takes practice and discernment. So I don't want you to get like all down on yourself or look back in time and be like, oh, I'm so embarrassed. I did all these things. Give yourself a break, right? What does Maya Angelou say? Oh, this is a paraphrase, but basically when we know better is the only time that we can do better. When we know better, we'll do better. That's it. So look at for yourself right now, do you have that oversharing or undersharing experience? Because neither one of those will create the bonds and the intimacy in your relationships that voluntary vulnerability does create. And so we're creating a little cheat sheet for you. So you'll have all these little notes of things that you can do so you remember how to do it. And give yourself a break, right? These are all things that you're only learning probably right now. So therefore, you have plenty of time to put them into your life. No regrets, right? Only looking back to learn. Not to beat yourself up and not to make yourself feel bad. So that is going to wrap it for today's episode. If you like this episode, do me a favor. Share it with the people in your life. If this brought any value to you, please share it on your social media platforms. Remember, I am going to be starting in April. We're going to be starting our live show on YouTube. So if you have not joined, if you're not subscribed to my YouTube channel, please do. I'm super excited. I'm going to be taking your questions live once a month on the Terri Cole Show, which will be my YouTube show. So I cannot wait to see you guys there. I hope you have an amazing week. And as always, take care of you.